The chain was a 30-pound logging chain, the kind used to drag felled spruce out of a muddy clear-cut, and it was bolted through a steel eyelet sunk directly into the concrete wall of Lorne Hadfield's storage lot on the north side of Kelowna. For the Belgian Malinois pressed flat against that wall in the dark, shaking in -18-degree air as the Okanagan wind tore down off the mountains. The war had not ended in Mali. It ended here in a gravel lot behind a pawn shop sold for $55. But 1,400 kilometers to the west, in a cramped apartment in Victoria, the woman who had bled beside him was already awake. The storage yard at Hadfield sat on a strip of service road just north of Highway 97, flanked by chain-link fence, topped with concertina wire and half hidden behind a row of decommissioned shipping containers. In the center of that yard, chained to the exterior wall beside the back entrance, was Rook. He was a Belgian Malinois, purebred, though no one who saw him shivering in January's darkness would have recognized the animal he had once been. His ribs pressed hard against his coat, his flanks were hollowed out. A raised scar, pale and wide as a thumb, ran along the left side of his rib cage, shrapnel from a DSK round that had torn through a compound wall in the Sahel 4 years prior and sent fragments spinning through the air like shards of glass. Inside his right ear, nearly invisible beneath a crust of dried mud, a military tattoo had been inked in fading green, C307. He was Canadian Special Operations Forces Command Military Working Dog C307, one of the most decorated canines to have served under the JTF-2 support element in 2 separate theaters. He had cleared compounds in northern Mali under 40-degree heat and swept vehicle checkpoints in Kandahar province before dawn in the brittle cold. He had once detected a pressure plate IED buried beneath 14 centimeters of packed sand, planted directly in the path of his unit, and he had done it with a single sharp signal, a hard stop and a backward press of his haunches into his handler's legs, 3 seconds before that handler would have taken her next step. Now he was the yard dog, chained outside, because Lorne Hadfield's tenants had complained that the animal barked in the night. Lorne had purchased Rook through a surplus equipment auction run by Phalanx Security Services, a private contractor that had held the dog's contract for 18 months following his reassignment from the Department of National Defense. The auction listing had described him as MWD, Belgian Malinois, 6 years, retired, hip evaluation inconclusive, surplus to operational requirements. Lorne had bid $55. He used Rook as a deterrent because a real security system required a permit and a monthly monitoring fee, and Rook just needed food, which Lorne provided intermittently and only when he remembered. The chain allowed approximately 3 meters of movement. The water bowl was a plastic paint bucket that had frozen solid 8 days earlier. Rook had been eating snow. His amber eyes, still sharp despite the cold and the exhaustion, still moved in slow arcs across the perimeter of the yard, cataloguing everything. The gap beneath Container 4, the motion of a plastic bag skittering across the gravel in the wind, the distant headlights of a semi-moving south on 97. He was still working. He had never stopped working. He was simply waiting for someone to tell him the mission was over. Master Corporal Neve Corbett, former Master Corporal, the rank now sitting somewhere in a file box at CFB Petawawa along with the rest of her service record, had been awake since 2 in the morning. That was not unusual. Sleep, since her medical discharge 14 months ago, had become something she negotiated with, rather than experienced. She would manage 3 hours, sometimes 4, and then some part of her brain that had never fully stood down would bring her upright in the dark, listening for sounds that no longer came. She was 29 years old. She had joined the Canadian Forces at 20, passed Kansofcom's selection at 23, and spent the following 5 years as a certified military working dog handler attached to a special operation support element. She had 2 operational deployments, a mention in dispatches she kept in an envelope she'd never framed, and a left knee rebuilt with titanium hardware that set off airport security scanners. She had been evacuated from a compound on the outskirts of Gao, Mali, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, bleeding from shrapnel wounds to her left leg and left side after a mortar hit the wall behind her position. In the chaos of that evacuation, Rook had been taken from her. The official record said, asset temporarily reassigned pending handler recovery. The unofficial reality was that while Neve spent 4 months at CFB Kingston learning to walk correctly again, a D&D acquisitions officer named Stuart Morell had approved Rook's transfer to Phalanx Security Services under a contract vehicle that required no parliamentary oversight. Neve had filed an adoption request from her hospital bed, then a second one, 6 weeks later, then a third, through a veterans advocate at the Royal Canadian Legion in Kingston. Stuart Morell's office had responded to each with a form letter that cited operational requirements and asset reallocation protocols. After her discharge, Neve had moved to Victoria, quiet, manageable, far from the flat geometry of Petawawa, and she had spent 14 months looking for Rook, the way some people look for missing children. She had filed ATIP requests through access to information and privacy legislation that came back largely redacted. She had hired a private investigator in Ottawa who traced Rook to Phalanx and then hit a wall when Phalanx refused to disclose their disposal records. She had contacted every military dog rescue organization in the country. The trail had gone cold 3 months ago. Then, on a Wednesday night in January at 2:17 in the morning, she refreshed the page on a Facebook group called Canadian Working Dog Watch and saw a post from a woman named Donna Kipp in Kelowna. The post read, "Walking with my dog on the service road off 97 north of town this evening, and there's a Malinois chained to the back wall of that storage place near the old Hadfield building. Looks in really rough shape. No shelter, bowl was frozen solid. Guy who came out when I knocked wouldn't let me near him. Dog has a scar across his ribs and what looks like a tattoo in his ear. Anyone local who does rescue. I can't stop thinking about him." Neve stared at the screen for a long time. Then she clicked on the single blurry photograph Donna had taken through the fence, zoomed in until the pixels fractured apart, and looked at the pale ridge of raised scar tissue running along the left side of the animal's rib cage. Her hands stopped moving. She sat very still in the blue light of the laptop for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and called Ben Garrick. Ben Garrick was in Kamloops, and he answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. He had been in the same CAN-SOFCOM support element as Neve. Different deployment cycle, Afghanistan rather than Mali, and he was one of 6 people in the country who understood, without needing an explanation, exactly what Rook had meant to her. He listened to what she said without interrupting. When she finished, there was a brief silence on the line. "How sure are you?" he asked. "The scar, left ribs, and the tattoo." "Kelowna. Kelowna." Another pause, shorter. "I'll call Flynn. He grew up in Penticton, he knows that stretch of highway, and Parker's in Vernon, he's practically at the front door. I can be in Kelowna by midnight. Can you make the 7 o'clock ferry?" Already looking at the schedule, Neve said. "Don't go in alone," Ben said. Not a reprimand. Just the flat, factual clarity of someone who had planned enough operations to know what happened when people moved alone in the dark. The SO pull-off north of the 97 overpass, the one with the old sign. "We'll be there." She caught the morning ferry to Tsavasan and drove the Coquihalla in steady snow, through the high country and down into the Okanagan Valley where the temperature dropped further, and the highway narrowed to 2 lanes flanked by dark pine. She stopped once, for coffee and fuel in Merritt, and sat in the truck with the engine running and the coffee going cold in her hand, and thought about the day in Gao when Rook had gone rigid against her legs, and she had looked down at his haunches pressed hard into her shins, and understood, without a single word passing between them, that the ground directly in front of her would kill her if she took one more step. She had trusted him completely, and he had never given her a reason not to. She pulled into the Esso pull-off at 11:47. Ben's dark green Silverado was already there, engine off, lights out. She parked beside it and got out into the cold. Flynn Garside was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was the winter gear. He had been the unit's dog trainer at CFB Trenton before he came back to Penticton to take over his father's orchard operation, and he nodded at her when she came around the hood, brief and warm. Parker Venn was leaning against the passenger door with a medic bag over one shoulder, and he looked at Neve with the careful, assessing quiet of someone who had kept people alive in circumstances that were not supposed to allow for it. Satellite imagery, Ben said, spreading a printed map across the hood of Neve's truck. 5-meter chain link, standard gauge, 2 shipping containers along the north fence. Main building runs east-west. Back entrance is at the northeast corner. There's a motion sensor light mounted above the door, but the angle throws a shadow gap across the northeast wall, about 4 meters wide. Hadfield lives on site, Flynn added. There's a trailer in the south corner. Light was on when I drove past at 9. 2 of us go in, Ben said. He looked at Neve. You and me. Flynn holds the north fence line. Parker stays with the vehicles and the kit. And if Hadfield comes out, Neve said. Then we deal with Hadfield. But the dog comes first. Everything comes after the dog. Parker opened the medic bag on the hood without being asked and laid out a field assessment kit. Stethoscope, warmed saline, IV line thermal foil blanket, pen light, dextrose solution. Methodically, without comment, as though preparing a triage station in a forward operating base, rather than a gravel shoulder outside Kelowna in January. They went over the approach once more, then they went quiet. At 3:45 in the morning, Ben cut the chain link at the northeast corner with insulated bolt cutters, while Flynn held the section taut to prevent noise. The cut took 40 seconds. He folded the section back into a gap wide enough to move through without catching gear. Neve went first. The lot smelled of motor oil and frozen mud and something faintly chemical she couldn't immediately identify. She moved along the inside of the fence, keeping to the shadow of the containers. The exterior light above the back entrance threw most of the northeast wall into a wide band of darkness, exactly as Ben had said. She could see the wall before she could see what was chained to it. Then she saw the chain, then she saw Rook. He was pressed against the concrete with his legs tucked under him, reducing his surface area against the cold. He was smaller than she remembered. Not smaller, she corrected herself immediately, just reduced. The lines of his body that she had known so completely, the slope of his shoulders, the tuck of his flanks, had been altered by weeks of too little food and uninterrupted cold. The scar on his ribs was clearly visible even in the dark. She could see the slow, shallow movement of his breathing. She stopped. She was 6 meters away. Rook's head came up. He was not fully alert. Exhaustion and cold had dulled his response time by a half-beat, which would have been unthinkable when he was operational. But his ears came forward and his nose began to work the air, moving in tight, rapid increments as he tried to process what his senses were delivering. He issued a low warning sound. Not a bark, just a rolling vibration in his chest that meant, "I know you are there, and I am not afraid of you, and you should think carefully about what you do next." Neve dropped to one knee in the frozen gravel. She pulled off her right glove and held her bare hand out at her side, palm upward, fingers loose. She breathed in, she breathed out, and she used the voice she had always used in the field. Not louder than necessary, flat, and even and absolutely certain. "Pass op, Jongen," she said. "Handler here." The warning sound stopped so abruptly it was as if someone had cut a wire. Rook went completely still. His ears stayed forward. His nose worked faster, pulling the cold air toward him in short, desperate increments, sorting through motor oil and frozen mud and everything else layered into the night until he found what he was looking for, the particular combination of lanolin and unscented soap and something underneath it that was simply the same scent his brain had mapped years ago and filed under the category of safe. He made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a bark, not a whine, something between the two, fractured and bewildered and rising slightly at the end, like a question he wasn't sure he was allowed to ask. She didn't wait. She closed the distance and went to both knees in the gravel and put her arms around him, and Rook collapsed against her chest with his full weight, knocking her back against the wall. His tail struck the concrete in a rapid, helpless rhythm. He pressed his nose into the side of her neck and breathed her in once, and then again, and made the fractured sound again, quieter this time, lower, the sound of confirmation rather than question. "Okay," Neve said into the top of his head, into the fur that smelled like cold and concrete, and underneath all of that, still somehow like him. "Okay, I've got you. Mission's done. You're done." Ben knelt beside her without a word and wedged the bolt cutters around the padlock. "Brace him," he said quietly. She tightened her hold. The lock snapped clean and the chain dropped away from Rook's neck and clattered against the gravel, and Rook flinched at the sound and then went still. "Package is free," Ben said into his earpiece, moving to extract. The entire northeast quadrant of the lot erupted into white light. A bank of halogen work lamps mounted on a crossbar above the back entrance came on simultaneously, and the yard went from near total darkness to a hard, flat brilliance that destroyed depth and shadow in every direction. An alarm began sounding from inside the main building, steady, electronic, insistent, and then the back door swung open. Lorne Hadfield was a broad man in his 50s, wearing insulated coveralls over thermal work gear, and he was carrying a bolt-action rifle held competently across his body in a way that suggested familiarity. Behind him came a younger man, heavier, who Neve registered and catalogued in less than a second. Lorne took in the cut fence, the two people in dark clothing, the unchained dog, and his face moved through several expressions before settling on something cold and deliberate. "Don't move," he said. Not a shout. The measured tone of a man who had considered the weight of what he was saying. "You're on private property and you'll find I'm well within my rights." Ben stood slowly, placing himself at an angle that was technically non-threatening and practically between Lorne and Neve. His hands were visible and away from his body. "We hear you, Mr. Hadfield," he said. "We're leaving. We're taking the dog." "That dog is my property. I have the invoice and the transfer documentation." Neve stood. She had Rook against her left side, her hand resting in the fur at the back of his neck. She looked at Lorne Hadfield and felt something she recognized from a specific afternoon in a compound outside Gow, in the seconds just before everything went wrong, a clarity so complete it was almost weightless. "His designation is C-307, she said. "He is a retired Canadian Special Operations Forces military working dog with 4 years of active service and 2 combat deployments. The invoice you're holding was issued by a private contractor that acquired him through a transfer process currently under federal scrutiny. Whatever that paperwork says, it is not going to survive what comes next." Something shifted in Lorne's face. The rifle didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. Parker's voice came through Ben's earpiece, low and even. "Ben. 3rd container from the north, the one with the compromised lock. I've got 4 ATVs inside and what looks like sprayer equipment. Registration marks have been ground off the frames. I can see it from the fence line." Ben let a moment sit between them. Then he looked at Lorne steadily. "The Okanagan RCMP has been running agricultural theft files for 2 seasons, Ben said. "Irrigation units, quads, orchard equipment, significant losses across the Similkameen and the South Okanagan." He paused. "That 3rd container of yours is throwing a lot of heat for January." The rifle came down 4 inches. Lorne's jaw tightened. Neve reached into her jacket pocket and placed a roll of bills on top of the nearest container. $400, she said. That's your 55 back with interest. That's more than reasonable, and you know it. Lorne looked at the money. He looked at the four of them, the way they stood, the way they had moved through his property without triggering anything until they were ready to be found. He made a calculation that was visible in his face, even if the answer wasn't. "Take it," he said, low and tight, already turning. He jabbed a thumb at the man behind him. "Kneel inside." The light stayed on as they went through the door, but the rifle did not come back out. Neve did not wait to see if that changed. She lifted Rook into her arms, all 28 kilograms of him, and carried him through the gap in the fence. He didn't struggle. He pressed his face against her chest and breathed. The interior of Neve's truck was warm within minutes of the engine turning over. Parker had the cargo area arranged before she arrived, thermal blanket on the floor, IV kit ready, penlight clipped to his jacket. He worked quickly and without narration, moving his hands over Rook, with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew how to assess damage without adding to it. "Moderate dehydration," he said, "malnourished but structurally intact. Core temp is low but sustainable. His hips are inflamed. Early dysplasia, I'd estimate. Heart rate is steady and strong." He swabbed a patch of skin on Rook's foreleg and inserted a line. "He's going to need imaging, prescription anti-inflammatories, and a serious feeding program for the next 8 weeks. But he's a fighter." Neve had her hand resting on Rook's head. Every 30 seconds or so, his tongue moved out and touched the back of her wrist, just briefly, just once, as though verifying a coordinate on a map he hadn't been able to read in a very long time. Ben drove south on 97 and then west toward the Coquihalla. Outside the windows, the mountains along the eastern ridge had begun their slow separation from the sky as the dark thinned toward gray. "What happens when the sun comes up?" Flynn asked from the passenger seat. "We go on a fence," Neve said. She called Alicia Bowman from a rest stop near Hope, while Rook slept in the cargo area with his head on the thermal blanket and his breathing deep and even. Alicia was a veterans' rights lawyer in Ottawa, sharp and methodical, who had spent 15 years doing to the Department of National Defense in federal courtrooms what Neve's element had done to infrastructure in 2 countries. Neve laid out the full sequence: the compound in Gao, the medevac, the 3 adoption requests, Stuart Morell's form letters, Phalanx Security Services, the auction invoice for $55, and listened to the silence on the other end gather itself. "Send me everything," Alicia said. "Every email, every form, every fax confirmation. The photos from tonight, whatever you've been able to pull of his military file. The auction listing from Phalanx, the invoice, all of it." A pause. "I am going to take this apart." She did not file quietly. Within 72 hours, the story of C-307 had broken in the Globe and Mail, then the CBC, then the National Post. Alicia had not leaked it so much as she had placed it, surgically, with journalists she trusted to ask the right questions of the right departments. The public response was immediate and enormous. Veterans organizations across the country posted statements of condemnation. A petition addressed to the Minister of National Defense, demanding a formal inquiry into DND's protocols for hiring military working dogs, reached 200,000 signatures in 4 days. Phalanx Security Services, already under scrutiny for separate contract irregularities, found itself named in a federal review that showed no signs of moving slowly. Stuart Morell was placed on administrative leave within a week. He appeared before a parliamentary standing committee 6 weeks later, where a member from Cape Breton asked him, on the record, whether he had read any of the 3 adoption requests filed by Master Corporal Neve Corbett while she was recovering from wounds sustained in service to Canada. The documentary record showed that he had not read a single one. Phalanx surrendered any claim to Rook without formal proceedings. The Department of National Defense, moving with the particular velocity that large institutions achieve only when the alternative is considerably worse, retroactively approved Neve's original adoption request, reclassified C-307 as honorably retired from active service, and issued a letter of commendation for his service record that listed, among other citations, the pressure plate detection outside Gao that had in all probability saved the lives of 3 personnel on the ground that afternoon in March. The letter arrived at Neve's apartment in Victoria in a standard brown government envelope. Rook was asleep on the couch when she opened it. She read it once, and then set it on the kitchen counter and sat beside him for a while without saying anything at all. The following October, on a weekday afternoon when the tourists had thinned and the Gary oak leaves along the Dallas Road waterfront had gone gold and brittle. In the autumn light, Neve Corbett stood at the edge of Willows Beach in Oak Bay and threw a ball far down the sand toward the water. Rook went after it like something released. He was unrecognizable as the animal who had been chained to a concrete wall in Kelowna. He had put on 7 kilograms of lean muscle. His coat was thick and close, and caught the light in a way that made him look almost bronze from certain angles. He ran with a slight favoring of his left rear hip. The dysplasia was managed now, not cured, and it probably never would be. But his stride was long and certain, and when he hit the shallow edge of the surf, he did not slow down. He crashed through it, snatched the ball from where it had come to rest in the foam, and turned back toward her at a full gallop. He dropped the ball at her feet with precise, deliberate care. Then he sat down in front of her and looked up at her face with amber eyes that had seen things most people in this city would never see, and waited. She knelt in the sand and pressed her fingers into the fur behind his ears, right over the small faded tattoo that read C-307. "Good work," she said quietly. "You held the line." Rook pressed his nose against her cheek, once and firmly, and then barked twice at the ocean. Bright, declarative, aimed at nothing and everything, and the sound carried down the beach and out over the water and dissolved into the clean Pacific air, which smelled of salt and kelp and the last warmth of the season, and had nothing in it at all of Kelowna or chain link or the cold dark of January, which is exactly what a beach in Victoria should smell like when the war is finally, completely over.